Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to Louisiana's Old State Capitol. My name is Ashley Shoptaw, and I'm the Education Curator here. And we are very excited to have the fourth speaker for you tonight in our series on Reconstruction in Louisiana. So these four talks, the other three can be found on our YouTube station. They are to help kind of gauge the public and engage the public on what they know, what they want to know about Reconstruction. All of this is ahead of an exhibit that we're hoping to have open in September called Reconstruction, A More Perfect Union, and that'll be a permanent exhibit here at the Old State Capitol. Of course, we are a Secretary of State museum, and we are very excited to have Dr. J. Jacob Calhoun, who is a postdoctoral fellow of the John L. New III Center for Civil War History with us tonight. He received his PhD in American History from the University of Virginia in 2024 and his bachelor's in history from Loyola University in New Orleans. His work has appeared in America's Civil War and Time, and he is a recipient of the Historic New Orleans Collection's Diane Wost Fellowship. His current book project, Vast Armies of Freedmen, Black Militias, and the Arc of Reconstruction, explores Black Southerners' martial efforts to preserve and defend Reconstruction in the Deep South in the wake of emancipation. So again, thank you all for coming out and supporting us tonight. Also, please add to your calendar our yearly annual gala that we'll be having in October. That's how we fund these programs and all of our exhibits. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to our speaker for the night, Dr. Jacob Calhoun.
Hey, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to the staff here at the Old State Capitol. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I mentioned to a few of you that actually when I started my graduate studies, I think the first two books I read were books by Dr. Charles Vincent and Dr. John Rodrigues. So I'm very excited to be up here and chatting with you all today about Louisiana's Black militias and the election of 1870. So I'm going to kind of talk a bit about what I mean by Louisiana's Black militias, specifically what militias I'm talking about, as well as I'm going to kind of discuss at the latter part of this talk a bit about the actual election of 1870 and why it matters, and why it's probably, I argue, probably one of the most significant elections during the Reconstruction period, and maybe in American history, I would argue. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start with the first slide. Okay, I'm going to be nodding like this to indicate for the next slide. So if you see me doing that, I don't just have a twitch, I promise you. Okay, so in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, in Ascension Parish, on the early hours of November 9th, 1870, drum and fife echoed across the parish. An army of about 1,000 Black militiamen marched towards the county court or parish courthouse to reclaim ballots that had been stolen from them by white insurrectionists. This army of about 1,000 free people was being led by 3 Black lawmen, David Fisher, Joseph Oliver, and Celestin Oliver. And this march, one witness reported, was highly militarized. One witness said, quote, "They marched by fours, arms at left shoulder shift, kept step, and appeared well drilled." What he was referencing there was the kind of militia activity that was very commonplace during Reconstruction by Black militiamen. And some of these militiamen were uniformed. They were wearing kind of the state militia's formal uniform, and many others were simply in plain clothes, local Minutemen, if you will, who were wielding everything from rusted infield rifle muskets to cane knives. But again, marching in military formation, they were able to rout the insurrectionists and reclaim their ballots without even firing a shot. At which point they celebrated and allowed the ballots to be reclaimed the next day by federal troops. So when we talk about Reconstruction, I think these are the images that we often conjure. Images of white federal troops standing in between newly emancipated freed people and violent white insurrectionists and terrorists like the Klan. We talk about this even in the language we use. When we say congressional Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, military Reconstruction. These are the terms for this period, and they all kind of center white federal troops and white Republicans as kind of the vanguard of Reconstruction. But the truth of the matter is that this is just simply not what Reconstruction looked like in the vast majority of the American South. Truthfully, this is what, if you actually go and like were to Google right now, occupied South or military reconstruction, these are some of the images that you would see. There we go. Perfect. So again, these look pretty, substantial, right? I mean, this seems like a pretty heavily occupied South. You can see the 5 military districts that the South was kind of divvied up into, and again, placed under federal occupation. The image on the left there is from a great digital project that I encourage you all to check out called Mapping Occupation, produced by Greg Downs and Scott Nesbitt with the University of Georgia. And this basically is supposed to show the occupied South. And if you see these images, it seems really substantial, right? It seems like white federal troops are basically all over the American South, propping up Reconstruction, defending freed people from this onslaught of the Klan. But if you zoom in, you see that that's just not really the case. So this is occupied northern Louisiana in October of 1868. This is, and it only gets less occupied from here. This is kind of almost the zenith of occupied northern Louisiana during Reconstruction. And we see that the number of actual forts here is about, or outposts is about 3. There's one in Shreveport, there's one in Grand Encore, Louisiana, and each of them house less than 200 federal troops. The largest of these outposts is actually Shreveport, and Shreveport has about, I think around 100, I believe it's, 131 federal troops. Yet in October of 1868, there is a brutal massacre that takes place during election season. This is not unique during the fall of 1868. I'll talk about this more in a bit. But the federal troops see that massacre take place, and by all accounts, they do nothing. They don't intervene. They don't try to help free people. And this is the largest outcropping of federal troops in northern Louisiana. So witnesses who saw this massacre take place and saw federal troops doing nothing, if they wanted to go find other federal troops in the hopes that they might intervene and hold those perpetrators accountable, they would need to travel 70 miles. Again, over swamp, and that's just as the crow flies, over through woods, et cetera, at which point they would find Grand Encore, Louisiana, and about half the number of federal troops, which again is striking because when we look at this, I mean, the question is, how is Reconstruction happening? This is about, in northern Louisiana, 25,000 square miles, and we're talking about a ratio of about 1 federal troop to every 1,000 citizens. So how is it that Black Americans are actually able to uphold Reconstruction? That's kind of the research question I have with my project, is understanding how Reconstruction gets off the ground. How come political maps of Louisiana during many years of Reconstruction look like this? The parishes outlined in red are parishes that flipped Republican during the April election of 1868. As you can see, it's pretty substantial. And Republicans, again, still at that point, the party of Lincoln, the party of the formerly enslaved, the party is pretty much populated almost exclusively by Black Southerners during Reconstruction. So again, how is this taking place without federal troops? My argument and my answer is essentially that Black Southerners are really the vanguard of Reconstruction. They form themselves into localized militia groups, as well as formal and informal groups to kind of bring the battle to the Klan. They are the ones that are guarding polling stations. They are escorting their leaders with armed retinues from place to place. They're essentially protecting them from assassination and intimidation, and they're very good at it. And this is essentially the story that I'm putting forward in my work. And for a bit, I'd like to kind of talk about why this matters and why this why these militias and their gains, the gains of Reconstruction, are so significant. So many of you may have seen the other talks, so I don't want to spend too much on this point, but just to briefly talk about why these electoral victories matter, why it matters that Reconstruction succeeds, why it matters that Black Americans voting. Obviously, it should be self-evident why democracy functioning for all citizens of the United States is important, but there are very real, tangible effects for electoral victories for Black Southerners during the post-emancipation period. Namely, they're able to, first off, bring elected officials into office, not just Republicans, but Black Americans for the first time. We have, of course, Oscar J. Dunn, the first Black lieutenant governor of Louisiana. Because of Republican votes, we eventually give, of course, VBS Pinchback, the first Black state governor in American history. But there's also more local impacts that are equally, if not more significant. Namely, there's the election of local Black sheriffs and constables to positions of authority. These were positions that were previously occupied by former slave patrollers or former Klan members that are now being occupied by Black Southerners. And they're using those positions of authority to protect all citizens equally as opposed to just a few. Additionally, many of these positions would be used during the antebellum period, positions like sheriff, coroner, constable, to essentially leverage the power of the state to ensure that Black Americans couldn't resist, to exploit their labor. And what we see is now during the Reconstruction period, when you have Black sheriffs and Black constables, et cetera, that we see Black Southerners kind of gain ground in terms of labor relations in both the sugar parishes and cotton parishes in Louisiana. And so there are real tangible effects to these electoral victories. But I mentioned that this is about militias, and I'd like to briefly talk about what I mean when I say Black militias of Reconstruction. What am I referring to? So when I say militias, I'm referring to kind of two discrete types of militias that I'm lumping into the phrase Black militia. One is the formal state militia. There's a formal state militia that is eventually brought into being between 1869 and 1870 that is populated, at least in part, but pretty substantially, by Black Southerners, Black Louisianans. But there's also an informal state militia, loose associations of freed people, community networks that essentially operate like Minutemen. And these are widespread. They're virtually operating in every parish. And in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, they are very much active, and they're benefiting, many of them, from military training. Louisiana witnessed widespread Black enlistment during the Civil War. The statistic that's often cited is 1 in 3 of all Black men eligible to join the Union Army in Louisiana did so. So many of these individuals are coming back, if not with outright arms, they're coming back with military training and a clear understanding of their place as citizens in the United States and citizens of Louisiana. So when they return, they oftentimes use that military training to, buttress their political rights, to essentially march and organize demonstrations even before they earn the right to vote. The New Orleans Massacre of 1866 is an excellent example of Black Southerners marching when they're first trying to clarify. Before the massacre takes place, the inciting incident is Black veterans essentially marching in an organized, column, basically displaying their kind of citizenship, or through this kind of martial display. And so there's this kind of push with these, I call them de facto militias, because they're not really recognized, they're not even really legal. We see that actually Southern states are not allowed militias after they're essentially the militias, which were again former slave patrollers, returned to the Deep South after the Civil War and begin this kind of rampage. Congress intervenes during radical Reconstruction or military Reconstruction and bans state militias. So, and that includes militias for Black Southerners. So from 1867 to early 68, these Black militias that are in operation are kind of quasi-legal at best. But I kind of want to talk about the details of how these militias operate, and I'm going to use a case study to do that. This is a story from, or a testimony from Joseph Gradney. He is a Black militiaman from St. Landry Parish, and he was asked about kind of how these local militias. These militias, excuse me, sorry, I said Mercer. Sorry,
Okay,
no,
I'm going to give you a different mic.
that works, yeah. No worries, I'm kryptonite to technology. Okay, we good? Is that working? Yep, perfect. So Joseph Gradney, again, this Black state militiaman from St. Landry Parish, is kind of testifying about how these militias, or his local militia rather, operated in St. Landry Parish. Mercer was his kind of militia commander. He said, quote, "Mercer said we must all of us be careful and keep ourselves on guard and try to keep arms if we could, but not to interfere with anybody unless they interfered with us. He said to try and treat everybody with kindness, so long as they would have kindness and respect for us, and that we had to allow them a little more than they did us, and to show them a little more respect than they did us. These were his instructions." So we see that in this moment, these militias are really kind of operating as communal self-defense networks. Essentially loose associations of, I use the term Minutemen, but it's also not just men, it's also women who are participating in this kind of collective armed resistance. And what's fascinating is that even when federal troops are not interested in facilitating this kind of communal self-defense, it's still effective. 1867 and early 1868. Are you, okay, I think we're good. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, keep going. All right, sounds good. So 1867 and early 1868 see the two first elections in Louisiana that allow for Black men to vote. And in those elections, Republicans gain substantial victories. We see that Black Southerners vote en masse. They go to the polls by the thousands, and the state flips Republican. We see the rise of the state's first Republican administration during this period. But this kind of success is built on the defense efforts of these Black militias. They're essentially able to defend themselves from would-be terrorists, would-be onslaught who would use violence and intimidation to keep them from the polls. But I mentioned that women were involved as well. And, oh, wait, no, could we go back one? Sorry. Okay, well, there we go. Yeah, okay, excellent. Thank you. So women were actually involved in this militia as well. Formal membership in these kind of militia networks was kind of reserved for men. Additionally, once the formal state militia is reconstituted and Black Americans join it, it is just Black men that are allowed within its ranks. But women are very much active in encouraging acts of communal self-defense. This is Joseph Gradney, testimony that he gave talking about his wife's perspective on self-defense. He said, quote, this is, again, Joseph Gradney, the Black state militiaman from St. Landry Parish, quoting his wife. Quote, "It is better for you to take your gun, for someone may attack you and try to hurt you. And even if you do not try to hurt anyone still, arms are always some protection, and they will be afraid to interfere with you." And this is, again, Mrs. Gradney. I don't have her first name. I'm still trying to find that out. But again, we see that Black women are actually involved in this kind of communal self-defense network. And that's what we see with reports. On election days, Black women are marching alongside Black men, even though the franchise is restricted to freedmen or Black men specifically. By one witness's account, who is not a very sympathetic witness, but basically says, quote, "The women and children turned out in very large numbers, so that it was very often almost impossible to make your way along the street." That's a testimony of Thomas L. Macon, a white Democrat, who witnessed Black women kind of marching alongside men on election days. And so this is a very common phenomenon. And because of this kind of solidarity that's expressed by Black communities in Louisiana, we see that these electoral victories. But we also see a kind of a backlash. Okay, now we're good. So this is a petition written by the white citizens of St. Landry Parish. That's actually how they present themselves. It is signed, well, first off, it's printed out on types print, and then it is signed by about 100 white citizens, many of whom are former planters, former ex-Confederates. And this petition is directed towards federal troops, in which the white citizens of St. Landry Parish are actually requesting greater federal occupation in their parish. And they're doing that because of the actions of the Black militia. They're citing the presence of armed Black men in the parish as reason enough for greater federal occupation to essentially disrupt said militia. And shockingly, white federal troops actually acquiesce to this demand. We see that after this, there is a Freedmen's Bureau agent by the name of O.H. Violet and a federal lieutenant or a U.S. Army lieutenant by the name of Lieutenant McGee, who show up during a Republican meeting in Opelousas in St. Landry and asserts, quote, "that these meetings had done much injury, that on account of them, troops had been ordered to this point. They did not in value amount to the weight of his pencil. The leaders of the club were politicians aspiring to office and should not be listened to, as they seek to deceive you. Still quoting here, colored men had the same rights as white men, but in the North, they did not hold political meetings of this character, end quote. Lieutenant McGee, later on, when he's grilled by his superiors about why he broke up a Republican meeting, for his defense says, quote, "My object in attending the meeting was to ascertain if arms were carried by those present," end quote. So essentially, we see that one thing that's unconscionable for both white Southerners and white federal troops is kind of armed Black militias operating independently and seemingly as kind of these kind of self-defense organizations. And so Lieutenant McGee, again, basically bans these Republican meetings from continuing in the state. And through this disruption, we see that he actually facilitates indirectly the widespread disarmament of the Opelousas and St. Landry militia by a white posse of St. Landry citizens. This posse essentially disarms the local militia through a kind of guerrilla campaign in the weeks leading up to the election of 1868, and then inaugurates probably the bloodiest instance of racial violence in American history, namely the Opelousas Massacre, which many of you may be familiar with. But one crucial thing about the story of the Opelousas Massacre that gets kind of brushed under the rug is that it's the actions of the Black militias that are actually successful. I mean, we see St. Landry Parish in April of 1868 registers thousands of Republican votes. And then in the November election after the Opelousas Massacre registers 0. And the reason for that is the destruction of this Black militia and the massacre that follows. So many scholars like Kadada Williams and William Blair have termed the kind of violence in the fall of 1868 as the killing fields of 1868. It's a term that I think is worthwhile to remember because the violence of this period is kind of hard to wrap our head around today. There's estimates that about 2,000 people were gunned down in Louisiana in just a few weeks surrounding the election of 1868, the fall election to be specific. Of that, the vast majority of them were freed men, women, and children. This violence was so commonplace that, again, it was believed that, or at least some estimates will put the number of people actually gunned down to be higher than the number of Louisianans killed in action during any single year of the American Civil War. So really striking numbers that we're talking about here. So the question of kind of why this happens, why this violence, how did these Black militias kind of get fractured? Like even with the federal obstruction, even with people like Lieutenant McGee coming up and breaking up Republican meetings, how is this violence able to manifest? Why do these Black militias fracture? Well, to begin with, they're beginning as kind of these de facto organizations. They don't have formal arms, they don't have resources, they don't have money, and they don't really have consistent leadership or a unified leadership. But one of the most important elements here is firearms. So Black Americans, after the Civil War, many of them retain their Enfield rifle muskets or Springfield rifles. They try to hold on to what weapons they can, but it is incredibly difficult for them to get ammunition, to get further arms, or to get the tools for gun maintenance. Virtually no gun sellers in Louisiana were willing to sell firearms to Black Southerners unless those sellers were general store owners who were themselves Black Americans. And yet, white Southerners quickly began to rearm themselves after the Civil War, and not just rearm themselves with, rifle muskets, but with new cartridge-loading repeating rifles. Really devastating forms of weaponry, like the Spencer 1865 carbine, that they begin to purchase en masse. We see that white Louisianans in just generally seem to buy out most gun store owners in the weeks leading up to the fall presidential election of 1868. In fact, the largest New Orleans gun seller, so the largest gun seller in the South, essentially, George Folsom, sold 2,470 rifles in just the months leading up to the election, almost all of which were shipped to rural parishes and purchased exclusively by white Americans, or white Louisianans specifically. For Black Americans, if you wanted again to purchase a gun, you had to either go to hopefully a local general store owner that might be willing to sell you a shotgun or something similar. But oftentimes Republicans or just anybody who was willing to sell weapons to Black Southerners would get targeted by the Klan. August Tooch, a German gunsmith from Claiborne Parish, was caught selling guns to local Black Southerners and was whipped nearly to death for it. So again, it's very difficult for free people to acquire the weapons to resist this newly armed and outfitted Klan. So this is kind of the effect of this disarmament and rearmament for white Southerners is pretty devastating politically. You can see in the April election of 1868, this is the gubernatorial election. Essentially, this is the election that brings Governor Henry Clay Wormuth, whose portrait you can see right outside. It's what brings him into office as the first Republican governor of the state. This is when these militias are very active, when they're able to kind of resist, again, white terrorist activity. But after this disarmament and rearmament campaign over the course of the summer, we see that during the killing fields of 1868, virtually almost all of the state's parishes that were flipping Republican are now flipping Democrat. Some parishes, like St. Landry, which had registered thousands of Republican votes in spring, registered 0 or just 1 to 2 in the fall. And I like to point out that this should be probably the end of Reconstruction in Louisiana. This is in some states where Reconstruction kind of ends. Tennessee, in many places, people put the end point of Reconstruction around this time. The violence here is really difficult for us to wrap our heads around because it is so commonplace. But it's not the end of Reconstruction. We see that in the immediate aftermath of this kind of devastating campaign of violence, of intimidation, and electoral violence, we see that Black Southerners refuse simply to give up on Reconstruction. In Louisiana, they begin, again, reforming their local militia groups as best they can. But importantly, in 1869 and 1870, we see the creation of the formal apparatus of essentially the state's newly reconstituted militia. This formal state militia receives 3 regiments, 2 of which are white, but 1 of which is composed almost exclusively of freed people, freedmen specifically. These regiments are put into the charge of ex-Confederate General James Longstreet, who kind of famously switches from being really a fire eater in the antebellum period to becoming a Republican. And although the 2 kind of white regiments for the state militia are largely confined to Baton Rouge and New Orleans, the Black Regiment is actually sent out into the rural parishes to bolster efforts by local militiamen and local Republican clubs to essentially rally after 1868. And that's exactly what they do, not least because they actually are able to now rearm many of these militias. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, many Southern Republican governors are essentially trying to rearm or just arm outright their state militias. This is a difficult task because many of them do not have the funds to do so. The governments are laden with debt. And so early on, Governor Henry Clay Wormuth goes to request weapons from the governor of Illinois, I think the governor of Ohio as well, all of whom refused to provide weapons to this new state militia, until eventually the Ordnance Department under the Grant administration provides the Louisiana State Militia with 2,500 firearms, most of which are Winchester 1866 repeating firearms. Really powerful technology that can kind of go toe-to-toe with the Spencer rifles that the Klan has been outfitting themselves with since the summer of 1868. Louisiana, important fact, actually gets the 2nd most firearms of any Southern state from the Ordnance Department during Reconstruction. It is worth saying that the state that receives the most firearms is actually South Carolina, and they receive approximately 5 times the number that Louisiana does, because South Carolina is seen as this kind of case study of, in many ways, for Reconstruction or pet project by the Grant administration. Happy to answer more questions about that later. But essentially, because of this kind of reconstitution of the state militia, we see that 1870 on election day, we see Republican victories emerge once again, and we actually have reports of these militias operating in tandem, both the de facto local organizations, these communal self-defense organizations that you can find in virtually every parish and within every Black community in Louisiana, and the formal state militiamen. Simply the presence of these formal state militiamen would bolster and encourage Republican turnout. But also the arms that they would bring and the training they would bring and the leadership they would bring would also assist in kind of the rallying of the local state militia that would be oftentimes sufficient enough to discourage the Klan from trying to engage in the intimidation on election day that they had done in 1868. One of the best examples I found is actually a report from I believe it's called the Southwestern in Shreveport, so Caddo Parish, which Caddo was, or is it Caddo or Cato actually? This is a great tip. Caddo, I knew I had it right. Thank you so much. So Caddo Parish was known as Bloody Caddo during this kind of period. Racial violence was incredibly commonplace. And again, 1868, during the Killing Fields, saw its own massacre at the local brickyard. And as a result, because of this widespread intimidation, we see that, in the fall of 1868, Caddo Parish flips Democrat with very few Republican votes registered. Yet even after all that violence, 1870 sees Caddo and nearby Bossier Parish, both of which had seen massacres in 1868, flip Republican. And one witness talked about why that was. And by the way, this witness was in no way, let's say, sympathetic to what he was witnessing. One moment. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I made the poor decision to make this double-sided. So this is again a witness talking about Election Day in Shreveport in 1870. Quote, "The election, the last Monday, passed off much more quietly than might have even been supposed. At an early hour, troops of freedmen, mounted on every variety of quadruped used for the saddle, came pouring in, and like well-drilled soldiers who had received their orders, marched to the arsenal, where two polls were opened by 8 o'clock a.m. There must have been over 1,000 of the colored population congregated there, including women, which latter, by the way, have been more turbulent than ever since the surrender of their lords and masters," end quote. So again, talking about, we see Black women and men participating in these militia displays, and again, using their kind of numbers to bolster this kind of activity. And they're essentially marching in military formation to discourage Klan violence. And it's because of this that we see, again, 1870, during this congressional election, virtually every congressional district in Louisiana every congressional district in Louisiana in 1870 flips Republican. And it is largely due to the efforts of this, what I call composite militia. This militia composed of both formal state militiamen and local community networks that work in tandem with one another to essentially discourage electoral violence. And they meet with surprising success. We could real quick go back to Donaldsonville, Louisiana. Perfect. Donaldsonville witnesses, I think, the best case study of this kind of militia in action, because white insurrectionists actually decide to hazard, engaging in electoral violence in Donaldsonville in 1870. There's a community of white Democrats and quote unquote conservative Republicans, all of whom are white, who essentially decided to seize the local ballot box in Ascension Parish, or 5 of the ballot boxes in Ascension Parish, garrison the local courthouse, essentially claiming electoral fraud. Claiming that there was widespread fraud, demanded that they essentially besiege the courthouse. In doing this, or in the immediate aftermath, Constable David Fisher, who was a member of the Metropolitan Police Force and part of the state militia, first begins to try to retrieve the ballot boxes with a number of Black state militiamen. This first attempt to retrieve the ballot boxes met with gunfire from these white insurrectionists. One of those injured was a militiaman by the name of Abraham Howell, who was a former USCT troop, or USCT Union soldier. UCT veteran, that's what I'm trying to say. During the war, Howell had actually been injured in one of his legs, and the shot that he basically endured during this combat or bout of combat injured him in his other leg, unfortunately. So again, we see this kind of like violence breaking out. Fisher decides to retreat because he only has a few dozen state militiamen. He doesn't think he can bring the fight to these insurrectionists just yet. So instead, what he does is he goes to the election commissioner, who gives him authority to, quote, deputize 500, or if necessary, 1,000 citizens, and execute the orders previously given, end quote, namely recovering the ballot boxes. And that's exactly what Fisher does. Fisher combs the parishes of Ascension, the plantations in Ascension Parish, and he musters in an army of around, we're not exactly sure, but probably around 500 freed people, some of whom bring with them, their rusted Enfield rifles, some of them bring their cane knives, some are just without arms and march alongside anyway. Eventually, Fisher's force meets up with a force commanded by the newly elected Black sheriff of St. James Parish, Joseph C. Oliver. Joseph C. Oliver was one of the few Black men during the Civil War to hold the rank of captain in the Union Army. And Oliver, along with his brother Celestin, join up with Fisher with their own force of about 500. And collectively, there's a force of about 1,000 freed people that they march into Donaldsonville and essentially reclaim their ballots successfully. I would say that this instance is without violence. although that's not entirely true. There is a moment in which there's an altercation between an ex-Confederate and the Republican mayor, actually, of Donaldsonville, who meets with Fisher's force at one point. And I'm happy to answer questions later. There's essentially an accident, and there's a volley, and an ex-Confederate and the mayor actually end up dead. Happy to answer more questions about that. So other than this kind of violent accident, the march itself is without any shots fired. The insurrectionists flee the courthouse, and the ballot boxes are retrieved. So thanks to these militias, this is what 1870 Louisiana looks like. Again, this is occupied 1870 Louisiana by federal troops. We see that the number is even less than it was in 1868. And yet this is the electoral map of Louisiana in 1870. Virtually all of these successes, I argue, can be attributed to the actions of local Republican clubs, bolstered by these de facto Black militia organizations who are, again, kind of working in tandem with the formal state militia. The two white regiments of the state militia, for the most part, are confined to New Orleans, St. Bernard Parish, and Baton Rouge, but the one black regiment of the state militia is being sent out to places like Shreveport, Ascension Parish, et cetera, again, to kind of sent to problem areas, for lack of a better term, to ensure that these local Republican clubs can get up off the ground. So, with that, I would actually like to talk about an event that has a direct relevance to where we are, to Baton Rouge specifically. Despite the success of 1870 for the Republican Party, for Black Southerners in Louisiana, it is not uniform. Violence still is present. I mentioned the violence in Donaldsonville, which is overcome, but there is an instance also of election violence during 1870 in which these Black militias are not able to overcome kind of this electoral violence. And the reason for that has to do with disarmament. So I'm about to talk about the Baton Rouge massacre of 1870. This was a big deal during Reconstruction, though I think it has largely fallen out of memory. So the Baton Rouge massacre in 1870 begins with kind of two individuals, I think at its core. One would be the governor, Henry Clay Warmoth at the time, who I feel like in this crowd, you probably know a lot about Henry Clay Warmoth, probably more so than me, but Henry Clay Warmoth is the Republican governor at the time. The local, and the other person of interest is the mayor of Baton Rouge, James E. Elam. James E. Elam is the mayor of Baton Rouge, but though this is actually not his picture up there. The guy with the mustache is, of course, Henry Clay Warmoth. I couldn't find a picture of James E. Elam, but I could find a picture of his father, James M. Elam. And so that is James M. Elam. I assume James E. Elam looked a little similar, but I couldn't find a picture of him, unfortunately. But essentially on the lead up to Election Day, James Elam, Mayor Elam is repeatedly writing to Henry Clay Warmoth, begging him to not send state militiamen, saying, we don't need it, the election's gonna be fine, I have it handled. There's no reason for Black militiamen or militiamen generally to be present at this parish. Warmoth just, after hearing that, decides, no, you're going to have militiamen present. Baton Rouge has been rife with violence since the end of the Civil War, so he sends in the state militia to essentially guard the polling stations on Election Day. And because he did so, Election Day actually passes off without any problems. It's a very peaceful election by all accounts. And at the end of the Election Day, around dusk, Mayor Elam turns to the election commissioner and the local constable. He basically says, okay, the election's done. Could we go ahead and have the militia disperse? At which point the election commissioner decides, fine, it's been peaceful, we'll go ahead and disperse the militia. The second the militia is dispersed, Mayor Elam summons a posse of white men, many of them ex-Confederates, and he immediately goes over to a nearby stockpile of weapons held by local free people. So a common practice on election days would be that Black Americans would essentially, before marching into town in that military formation, oftentimes take their weapons and put them in a stockpile near town. The purpose being that if they needed them, they were there, but so that they weren't marching down the main street actively armed, because the fear is that if they did that, that might provoke some kind of violence were they to do so, but they wanted them on hand. So that's what happened in Baton Rouge. The local Black Republican Club had kind of stockpiled their weapons in the same place. Mayor Elam uses his local posse that he formulated to essentially take those weapons and disseminate them throughout the local white citizenry of Baton Rouge. After which, there begins a very familiar story for those of us who've studied Reconstruction violence, as we see that these white Southerners, this white posse begins to basically begin an indiscriminate slaughter of local militia groups and militia participants. They begin to gun down freed people. According to one witness, quote, "Colored men were shot down in the street wherever they were found," end quote. These white terrorists not only tried to kill Black men, but also literally destroy their votes. There were many accounts that they were this white posse grabbed the ballot boxes and fired their weapons repeatedly into the ballot boxes in an effort to actually destroy the physical ballots of Black citizens of Louisiana. As a result of this kind of carnage, eventually a number of local free people actually responded. They marched into town, but they were without weapons largely. And so as a result, the white terrorists essentially gunned them down. There were 20 people shot in total, all of whom were Black Louisianans, 4 killed outright. A few others, I'm not sure how many, died later from their wounds. Afterwards, this was enough to interest the locally stationed U.S. troops. They didn't do anything to stop the violence, but they came kind of after the fact and basically found the victims. They were able to arrest a few of the perpetrators initially, and by all accounts, their Schofield revolvers were still warm from consistent use. And later on, reports were found that some of the participants in this posse had bragged when they had purchased guns the day before the election that they would only need the gun on election day. And so after this kind of violence, we see that these individuals are actually prosecuted at first under the Federal Enforcement Act of 1870. This is a federal piece of legislation under the Grant administration intended to curb Klan violence. However, none of those perpetrators ever see any jail time. In fact, the only people to see jail time under the Federal Enforcement Act in Louisiana are the 3 Black lawmen who led the march in Donaldsonville. They are the only ones actually to see any jail time as a result of the Federal Enforcement Act, at least in Louisiana. The New Orleans Republican decried this outcome, saying, quote, "Such is the Louisiana democracy. Such is the conduct of men calling themselves chivalric. Beaten with the ballot, they resort to the bullet. Foiled again, they resort to mendacity and slander. They charge the colored people with doing what they themselves have done and assume a superiority which neither their number nor their conduct give them." So just as in the Opelousas massacre, and just as in the Colfax massacre, and the Shreveport massacre, and the Bossier massacre, none of the individuals who participated in these massacres were ever faced any form of actual successful conviction or any jail time whatsoever. Again, the only people who faced jail time after the election of 1870 are those 3 Black lawmen who were imprisoned both in Donaldsonville and New Orleans for a number of months. So essentially, even though the Baton Rouge massacre is a horrific story, it's not uncommon for Reconstruction Louisiana. What is fascinating, I think the important thing or element of this story about the reason that I think the election of 1870 is worth talking about is because of the successes that we see. Again, this is the kind of electoral map in 1870. We see that there's a rallying point, and it's kind of hard to imagine the resiliency displayed by Louisiana freed people after they had endured, again, unimaginable violence in 1868, widespread racial violence, widespread voter intimidation. Despite all of that, 2 years later, they are marching by the thousands to the ballot box in virtually every parish in Louisiana. And so that's, I think, the main takeaway with this story, is that the resiliency that Black voters showed in the aftermath of not just the Civil War, but the aftermath of Reconstruction era racial violence. I earlier showed a number of images that I said this is what we often think about Reconstruction looking like, Freedmen's Bureau agents, federal troops, et cetera. This, I think, is actually a better contemporary representation or artistic depiction of what Reconstruction actually looked like. This is from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper from 1873. It's a depiction of the Colfax Massacre. And I appreciate this visual because I think it foregrounds the actual vanguard of Reconstruction, the people who did the work of Reconstruction, who actually ensured that there was, quote, a brief moment in the sun, to use Du Bois' term, for the formerly enslaved. It's Black Southerners that held up Louisiana democracy in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. It is because of them that we see the state's, or the American South's, first multiracial democracy. And this story isn't just Louisiana's story. all across the American South, where you see Reconstruction succeeding, you can often find an active Black militia in some capacity. So I want to thank you all very much for your time, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yes.
And I have a mic for you, actually.
First off, thank you. This is very informative. I'm currently reading Du Bois's or Du Bois, depending upon how you want to pronounce it, Black Reconstruction. And so some of these things that you're talking about, I'm revisiting because it is my position. A lot of folks are talking about that we are back in a time of the civil rights movement. That's not my argument. My position is that we are in a time of Reconstruction and or post-Reconstruction. My question to you is, though, is that I heard you say the ballot of the bullet. The first time I had ever heard that term was Malcolm's speech, the ballot of the bullet. So I'm wondering, my question to you is that, do you believe that Malcolm was aware of this and took that term from Louisiana and Reconstruction? Do you think there's any connection there? Just interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, a great question. So I think, yeah, I mean, whether or not Malcolm X was aware of that specific usage, I'm not sure. I will say Malcolm X was very well read. And, when he's talking about, I believe, what is it? A ballot is a bullet, in his kind of, framing of it, the idea that, you use it and deploy it carefully and for political reasons, but that, it is powerful and has to be used as such. The comparison of ballots and bullets happens a few times actually during this period. It's a very common, because I think of the way it sounds, right? It's very common in Louisiana newspapers. Lincoln has the famous quote that, the ballot is stronger than the bullet. My quip to that is not in Louisiana. The bullet normally wins out when put up against the ballot. You normally need to have both if you're going to win Louisiana, win elections in Louisiana. And that's actually something that, Stephen Hahn, wrote A Nation Under Our Feet, talks about in his work. He says, paraphrasing here, but politics in the post-emancipation South came out of the barrel of a gun. And that's pretty accurate in many ways, but the goal for many of these Black militias is to not have to rely on force, right? They're using their arms and participating in these armed demonstrations specifically so that they can have peaceful and fair elections. In those instances where Black militias go toe-to-toe with white insurrectionists or Klan members like they do in Donaldsonville, the immediate aftermath after their victory, there is no massacre of like white Southerners, right, in any of these parishes. There's the preservation of democracy. Whereas the same cannot be said on the other side, right? When, white terrorists are able to kind of overwhelm these Black militias, there's an indiscriminate slaughter because their goal is disenfranchisement, right? The stripping away of ballots. There's the question about too, are firearms and the right to bear arms, is that a question or a theme? Is that a goal for many of these militias? But essentially, what I would say is the firearms are kind of a tool for political engagement. You need them if you're going to be able to vote safely, essentially, in the Reconstruction South. And both white terrorists and Black militiamen know that, and Black militia women know that.
We have another question.
So I'm interested in the role of the Black woman and I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that, because I think you had a slide on that and their role of presence being there and how important that was to this endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's in terms of let me say this. It is not just Black men wielding firearms to combat the Klan. Black women actually do it all the time, especially in the latter years of Reconstruction when night riding is really taking off during the 1875 and 76. Many times, the Klan will essentially come to a household, and normally if there's a Black man in the household, that they will normally flee, because if they are caught, they will certainly be lynched. But Black women will often kind of stay there, essentially, basically hoping that, they will be spared. They might have to endure sexual violence or other forms of brutal violence, but that they might not immediately be lynched. But in many cases, Black women grab the local shotgun or shotgun they have underneath the chimney and fend off white terrorists. That happens in multiple instances. And my records, according to testimonies from 1875 and 76. So there's this kind of localized resistance. But what I find fascinating is that during these public demonstrations, on election day, it's entire families that go out to basically express their solidarity. Because even in parishes where there is a minority of Black Americans, like in St. Landry, for instance, it's a white majority parish. Despite that, you see kind of that Black voters seemingly have a greater turnout on election day because they understand the significance and the dire situation if they don't win the election. And so to kind of bolster that solidarity, I find that, Black women participate in these political demonstrations along with their families. They don't always go to Republican club meetings. Those are often seen as kind of like men's domain, et cetera. They're also not seen as part of the formal state militia or seen as, formally members of the local Minutemen, et cetera. For instance, the Donaldsonville March, I don't have records of women participating in that. But on election day, they are right alongside men demonstrating. And oftentimes, they also seem to be, wielding arms in personalized forms of self-defense. So again, they're engaged in the ways that, they could politically be engaged at the time. But also they're normally, as we see, some of the most ardent advocates for the use of these militias. They're the ones saying we need to go around armed because if we don't, the Klan is going to target us.
Thank you. And do we have any other questions? No? Okay.
Back again. One, how do you purchase the book? Because I was hoping that you would bring some books here for us to purchase, but if not, I guess I have to go on Amazon, which I really don't want to do.
The book is not out yet. The book is not. It is currently being written, I guess would be the way to think. The dissertation's done, and I'm happy to send the dissertation to someone.
I'll give you my email. I would love to read it. The next question is that there's lots of talk currently about voter turnout, particularly among African Americans. And so my position has always been that there is political fatigue. And so when I see this, a lot of narrative is always around like, well, we haven't voted a lot, we haven't voted a lot. And what you're talking about really flies in opposition of that. And so if you would talk about like the rhetoric around voter turnout, not really quite being truth or honest. In fact, your work, your research flies in opposition of that. And do you believe that there's a direct correlation between the post-Reconstruction violence and the lack of voter turnout that we're seeing now?
Yeah, great question. So I will say during this era, the amount of voter turnout shown by Black populations across the American South is staggering. For instance, I think one thing I often cite is South Carolina, because in South Carolina, there's rampant violence in 1870 as the Klan basically inaugurates their kind of campaign of terror. It's what kind of spurs eventually, the U.S. Army to be sent in by Grant to kind of deal with the Klan. We have the famous Ku Klux Klan trials. But even during that period, when there's widespread violence, when the Klan is perpetrating some of the worst massacres they ever do in South Carolina, most of the state still flips Republican. Violence isn't enough to keep Black Americans from the polls. It is only when there is no hope of success, when by 1876, where these Black militias have been thoroughly disarmed, the retreat from Reconstruction is fully underway, that they just have no resources, that finally Black Americans will often go, okay, we can't go to the polls because we're going to get gunned down and we're not going to be able to win, essentially. But generally speaking, it takes overwhelming violence to keep Black Southerners from the polling stations. The turnout for most of these parishes, I have to guess, would probably be around 90%. I mean, you see that like the amount of Black Southerners voting is more or less around the same number of Black voting men in the actual parish. And that's not uncommon. And so that's why even in white majority parishes, if on election day, there's a real chance that, Republicans win the parish because Black Americans just have such great voter turnout. In terms of, bringing it kind of to today, I would say there's a number of scholars also who talk about like, I think Martha Jones' book Vanguard, talking about Black women voters, talking about how like Black Americans have largely kind of had a far better turnout than oftentimes, white populations, Black women in particular, have far better turnout than virtually any demographic in the United States over the course of the 20th century. And so I think that, this narrative that, Black Americans are not like, electoral fatigue, really only, in the 19th century, really only manifests when there's like no hope of success of winning the parish or county. And that's only in 1875, 6. And in some places that doesn't happen until the 1880s. Ascension Parish, Lafourche Parish, those parishes actually continue to flip Republican up until Governor Nichols, I believe, sends in PGT Beauregard with a Gatling gun to break up black militias in 1887 in the Tippecanoe Massacre.
So as I'm watching your presentation, I've noticed that it kind of bookends the two could have beens of Louisiana Reconstruction. John Willis Menard, who was elected to the House of Representatives, never sat. PBS Pinchback, who was elected to the U.S. Senate and never sat. But in 1870, do you really feel the militias deserve the credit for Louisiana's elections going well and that entire delegation being sat in the United States Congress?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat that last part of the question?
So I think the militias deserve the credit, number one, for the elections going the way they did, but number two, so that the entire delegation was sat, to my understanding, unless they weren't, when they got to Washington in March.
Yeah, so this is a question like how much, how much is actually, the black militia doing versus how much is Warmoth also tabulating the ballots, right? That's a big question. And that was one of my research questions going in. How do I know that Black Americans are like voting en masse and not just Warmoth kind of choosing? So to clarify, Warmoth has an election law that he writes or that signs into law in 1868 after the widespread violence of that year, basically giving him full control over the returning board. And essentially, if he wants to decide who gets elected, and Warmoth is not shy about using that power. But what's fascinating is that you see reports in newspapers about on election day, these militias in operation in Ascension Parish and in Shreveport and other locations. We see that, these black militias are in operation and we see massive voter turnout, and so, for instance, in Shreveport, that article, I think it might be in the quote, but they also go on to say, like, they know exactly who won. It's a Democratic newspaper, and they say something to the effect of, oh, it was, we all know how this is going to end up going. The Republicans have won this parish, and it's because of our poor turnout, et cetera. And they begin to list off the blame, et cetera. So it's because of the kind of, coverage of the actual turnout that kind of I'm basing on the success. I also, there is a good chance that some of those parishes that are on the fence, Warmoth just went ahead and, selected who was going to be placed in charge. But the massive turnout happens, and it doesn't happen in the fall of 1868. That's very clear because of, again, the widespread voter intimidation, widespread violence. So, Caddo Parish and Shreveport doesn't see any black voters, essentially marching to the polls on election day in 1868 by all accounts, because they've been enduring massacres for weeks on end. So yeah, great question. And again, that idea of like, how much is this, the electoral map, how much can you trust it? I mean, Louisiana's votes, electoral votes for president in fall of 1868 are all just thrown out because there's just so much violence. Oh, excuse me. But yeah, I think to say that I would very much credit the militias because that's who Democrats are crediting. You know what I mean? In their kind of coverage, they're not crediting is wrong term. Blaming, I guess, would be the way to say it. But that's who they're kind of pointing at as the reason for the flip